Chapter 15. I entered the doctor's office at 9 a.m. Butterflies tumbled in my stomach. Today was the day I would find out for sure the gender of the baby. "Morning, Callie," the perky brunette receptionist greeted me. "Good morning," I smiled back, signing in on the sheet. "Are you ready for the ultrasound?" the receptionist asked. I touched my stomach, smiling as the baby moved against my hand. He or she had started moving a few weeks ago, and I still couldn't get over the sensation. I sure am, though I'm pretty sure I already know the gender of this one. I sat down in a brown chair and waited to be called back in the room. "Are we waiting on anyone?" the technician asked when I was called back. "No." I raised my shirt and lay back on the cold hospital bed. "It's just me." "Okay." The blonde technician pushed her glasses up her freckled nose. She grabbed the tube of gel from the tray by the bed. "Sorry, this will be a little cold." I flinched as the cold gel hit my stomach. The technician grabbed the wand and began spreading the gel around. "So first I'm going to take pictures, and then maybe we can determine gender if you want, and if this little one cooperates." Grainy black and white images began to appear on the screen, and I drew in a quiet breath. While I wasn't sure what each picture was, I could easily pick out the baby's head. I glanced at the technician and weighed whether the woman would be offended by the question I wanted to pose. "Can I ask you a question?" "You want to know what everything is?" the technician laughed. "Everyone does." "Well, yes, but that wasn't my question. It's kind of personal, I guess, but I wanted to know how anyone can look at an ultrasound that clearly shows a baby like this and then choose an abortion." The technician stopped for a minute, lowered her voice, and leaned in. "It's not my area, but I honestly don't know either. You see this here?" She pointed to a grayish part at the top of the picture. "That's your baby's brain, fully formed and full of pain receptors like ours. And here," she moved the wand, "baby's feet. 10 perfect toes, by the way. I know some people say fetus, but I've done so many of these, they are all babies to me." I smiled at the young blonde. "Don't worry, I won't tell your secret." She winked. "Would you like to know gender now?" the technician smiled back. My heart sped up as I nodded eagerly. "Well, I'm 99% sure it's a girl, but I wouldn't mind the verification." The wand circled some more and I held my breath. "Well, it's always a little harder to determine with girls, but I'd say your inclination is correct. Does everything look okay? I mean, is she okay?" The technician patted my arm. "She looks great, and I'll print out some pictures you can take with you." As she stepped out of the room, I wiped the rest of the gel off my stomach and returned my shirt to its proper position. Relief flooded me with the knowledge that the baby was okay. My hand touched my stomach again. A girl. I knew it would be a girl. The technician re-entered with several black and white photos of the little life that was inside me. As I held them, a warm sensation spread from my head all the way to my toes. I studied each one carefully, marveling at how much I could see. Hands, feet, heart, brain, profile. There was no doubt in my mind now. This was a baby. My hope. About the time I was beginning my ultrasound, JD was meeting with Scott at a nearby coffee shop. "So, what did the big man upstairs say?" Scott joked as he poured his tall frame into an empty chair. The shop was relatively slow, so they had their choice of seats. JD smiled and sat across from him. "Well, I prayed, I listened, and I'm 98% certain this is the right building for us." He lifted his cup and took a sip of his coffee. "Only 98%? Why not 100? Scott cocked an eyebrow. "I would never confess to know 100% of God's plan. There is still a lot of my old ways in my head that try to mislead me. So even though I try hard to make sure I'm hearing what he is saying, I can never be completely sure I'm not at the same time influencing myself a little." Scott raised his eyebrow and leaned forward. "You really are into this God thing, aren't you?" JD smiled and took a sip of his coffee. He could tell that Scott thought he was a little nuts, but he was used to that. God has been there every time I needed him. And besides, it's nice to know where I'm going when I die. Scott blinked and took a sip of his coffee. "What do you mean?" JD set his cup down and leaned back in his chair a little. "Well, Scott, there's only one of two places any of us can go to after death. Those who have a relationship with Jesus will get to fellowship with him in heaven, forever. Those who don't, well, the Bible says that when they stand before God, he will say, "Depart from me, I never knew you." And that statement will earn a non-believer a one-way ticket to a place that is nowhere near heaven. It's a place where men and women will forever be separated from him. Scott's mouth fell open before he could catch himself. "Do you really believe in a heaven and hell, JD?" "I do. And believe me, the Bible's description of hell is a place no one would want to go. And that's why we believers work so hard to tell people about Jesus." Scott narrowed his eyes and glanced around the coffee shop. JD followed his gaze, but the coffee shop was just getting busy, and no one seemed to be listening. "So you're saying if I don't choose Jesus, I condemn myself to hell, and you're trying to help me prevent that by telling me about him?" JD nodded and picked up his drink again. "I think everyone deep down inside knows that God exists. I mean, how else did we get here? Scientists don't even buy the whole amoeba theory anymore because they can't recreate it. No one can, because God made us in his image, according to the book of Genesis. So whether anyone talks to you about Jesus or not, you choose to reject him by default because you do not follow your suspicion and try to find out about him for yourself. You did not pursue the truth to see if he exists. You simply chose to ignore him and continue to follow the world's thinking on the matter, and thereby you turn your back on God and must live with the consequence of that decision." Scott leaned back, sipping his coffee. JD could tell that his words were having an effect, but he wasn't sure what effect. He wished, not for the first time, that he could read minds. "So, are you telling me that almost everyone today is wrong?" Scott finally said. JD held up his hands, palms out. "Look, I'm not to judge. Only God can do that. I've done a lot of things in my past that I'm not proud of. But what's going on in our country today is not what God wants for America. As a nation, we removed him from schools, and kids started killing each other. We allowed sex education to be taught in schools, and now we hand out condoms instead of teaching kids to wait until after marriage to have sex. Scott, this country was founded as one nation under God, indivisible. But we have become divided because we, as Christians, haven't been standing up against the atrocities that have been occurring over the last several decades of time. We let them continue and hoped that somebody else would do something about it. But no one has. God destroyed earlier cities for practicing things we praise today, and I don't know how much longer he'll keep watching all of the evil we are not confronting before he feels the need to cleanse the earth again." Scott gripped his cup tighter. His eyes darted around again. JD's words were obviously making him uncomfortable. "You don't believe he will wipe the earth out, do you?" "Actually, I believe he can, and someday will. You see, God had the Bible written to tell us about him, about what has happened and what will yet happen. While he hasn't told us when the end will come, he has told us to be ready for what will precede it, the rapture of God's children. The removal of believers from the earth will occur first. Then the world will be thrown into 7 years of horrible tribulation. After that, there will be 1,000 years of peace on earth because Jesus, the Son of God, will for that time period reign over everything. God did reveal some signs in the Bible that let us know when the end time is getting close, and some of those signs are happening now. There's a lot of debate about the signs and what they mean, but one or two that are very clear are that the world will have the power to destroy itself, which we do now with all our nuclear weapons, and there will be worldwide communication, because at one point, 2 prophets of God will be killed, and will lie in the streets for 3.5 days for the whole world to see them. Now, the world hasn't been introduced to these prophets yet, but we're technologically advanced enough that when they die, they will be seen by everyone in the world at once. Plus, Christians will be persecuted, and that is also happening now. Finally, Jesus said that once these signs begin, the generation of that day will not pass away before he returns to govern the whole earth. Now, of course, we aren't sure how long a generation is in God's eyes, but it seems that if these prophecies can now be fulfilled, they soon will be. The color drained from Scott's face, and his shoulders dropped as he leaned forward. "So what happens to the rest of the population when the believers are taken from the world?" "Well, no one knows for sure, but did you ever read the Left Behind books?" "I'm not much of a reader," Scott admitted, more of a football fan. JD could tell Scott was trying to make light of the situation. "Hey, I like football as much as the next person, but this is about eternity. I'll tell you about the book someday or loan you mine. I tend to think something along those lines is what will happen. First, many will die in crashes because driving believers will disappear. Airplanes will spin out of control or crash for the same reason. Second, those who live will see other signs. They will see a man claiming to be God and doing miraculous things, and they will have to decide whether to take his mark on their body or choose to follow God instead. Scott scratched his chin. So people could still get saved during that time? I believe so. But Scott, please don't wait. What if you are left behind and you die because believers who are responsible for you have disappeared? That's a lot to hedge a bet on. Scott nodded and sipped his coffee. His eyes stayed focused on the beige cup in his hands, and JD couldn't gauge his reaction. He held his tongue as the seconds ticked by, giving the man time to think. You're right. Scott raised his eyes. The humor was gone from them, replaced with a serious expression. You've definitely given me a lot to think about. Relief flooded JD. This was always the hardest part of being a believer, sharing with non-believers. He didn't like telling people they might be wrong, but he didn't want their souls on his conscience either. It had taken him years, but he was finally feeling more comfortable sharing the word. Look, let's sign the papers, and then why don't you find a church nearby, and we'll go together this Sunday. Deal, Scott agreed. I tapped the steering wheel, impatient at the long line. Rotating my wrist, I glanced at the face of my watch. 10 minutes left. I was going to be late, and I hated being late. If I wasn't sandwiched between two cars, I would have just backed up and foregone the drink. But a car had pulled in right behind me, and now I had no place to go. My thumbnail returned to my teeth. I had to kick this nervous gesture before I chewed my nails off completely. Maybe if I texted Tina, she could stall until I returned. As I reached for the phone and my purse beside me, 2 men exited the coffee shop. The broad shoulders and chin-length hair grabbed my attention, and my breath caught in my throat. It couldn't be. Forgetting the phone, I craned my head to follow the man as he walked to the cars in the parking lot. He had the same gait, the same grace, but what on earth would he be doing in my town? A horn blared behind me, returning my attention to the line I was in. The car ahead had moved, and I inched mine up to fill the empty space. I glanced back for the man, but he had disappeared into a car, and I had no idea which one. Frustration roared again, and I pounded the steering wheel with open palms. I couldn't lose him again. The line moved again, and I forked over my money, no longer caring about the steaming chai tea I placed in the cup holder before exiting the drive-thru and returning to work. You're late, Tina hissed as I approached the desk. I slapped my forehead. I had forgotten to text Tina and ask her to cover. I know. Have they started? A smile broke out on Tina's face. No. I told them your appointment ran late, but they're waiting for you. Thank you, I mouthed, and turned to the hallways that led to the conference room. Wait, don't take your drink. I had forgotten the tea was even in my hand. Here, it's a chai tea. Enjoy. Tina blinked in surprise, but took the outstretched cup, and I continued to the boardroom. The other members of the small team were already inside. Issuing a quick apology, I pulled out the open chair and sat down. The stiff back made it impossible to get comfortable. Discreetly, I tried to adjust and switch positions. Jeff, the man heading the team, began speaking, but his words flew by my ears. My thoughts were still on the man at the coffee shop. There was a chance it hadn't been JD. After all, the country was huge, and last I knew he was in New York. But if it had been him, I had to find a way to run across him again. But how? Does that work for you, Callie? The sound of my name cut through my interior monologue, and my face heated as I realized I had not been listening. I'm sorry. I was distracted. Can you repeat? Jeff sighed. He had never been a fan of mine, probably because I had once beaten him at a case and then rubbed it in his face. I should apologize for that. He had fought to keep me off this case, but hadn't won. I asked if you could handle researching previous precedent. Yes, I nodded, determined to keep my mind on the discussion for the rest of the meeting. I can handle the research. Perfect. Jeff turned his attention from me and continued detailing his plan. To keep my mind focused, I retrieved a pen and a small notepad from my bag and took notes on the rest of the meeting. Thank you for covering, I whispered to Tina at the end of the day. Tina was busy putting the work in neat little stacks for the next day, which was one reason I loved having her as an assistant. I'm not sure Tina had always been so organized, but when she had first started working for me, I had insisted that everything always be in neat piles. It was the only way I could work, and Tina had promptly conformed without complaint. "You're welcome." Tina placed the last paper and then neatened the pile before looking up. "Thanks for the tea. What happened, by the way?" "I think I ran into my past." Tina's face clouded over and she crossed her arms. If this was the face she used on her children, I could see why they behaved so well the few times they had been in the office. "Don't tell me it was Daniel." "No." I stole a furtive glance to the left and right to make sure no office gossip lingered nearby. "I think I saw JD." Tina squealed and then clapped a hand to her mouth as I shushed her. "Sorry," she said softly. "Are you sure?" "I'm not. I just saw him for a moment while I was waiting in line at the drive-thru. What a dumb idea that was. But that build is hard to forget." My face warmed at the thought of JD's muscular frame and the solidness of his chest. Now I just have to find a way to find him again. "Do you know what he does? Maybe we could check out some of the similar companies and see if he's doing work for them here." I mentally kicked myself for my previous self-absorbed attitude. "I don't," I sighed. "All I ever knew was that he owned a business. Why hadn't I asked him more questions about himself?" Tina's eyes held the same question, but she was nice enough not to voice it out loud. "Let's pray then that God finds a way for you to meet. After all, if it is JD, the Lord brought him here." Tina had the knack for always finding the positive. Though I was growing daily, I was still floundering in some areas, and seeing the silver lining was one of them. But Tina and my mother seemed to have it down. I hoped one day it would become second nature for me as well. After another secretive glance, praying at work wasn't forbidden, but it could cause problems. We whispered a prayer and then walked out of the building together. I waved goodbye as we separated at the parking lot. Tonight was my mother's night off from the inn, so she was making dinner at home. Though not a bad cook myself, I still loved my mother's cooking. It reminded me of a simpler time in life. My mother's old Ford Taurus was in the driveway of the small yellow house when I pulled up. An old tattered rope swing still hung lopsided from a branch of the sole tree in the front yard. I remembered always begging my mother to go outside and swing on that swing. I hadn't known it then, but I realized now it had been my coping mechanism after my parents split. On the swing, I could pretend to fly to another world where daddies never left and mommies never cried. I parked the car and stepped out. The grass covering the rest of the yard was a faded yellow and crunchy under my feet as I walked up to the front door. I'd have to remind my mother to water the yard or see if I could afford to hire someone to do it all the time. Twisting the front handle of the faded white door, I stepped inside. The smell of Mexican seasonings flew through the air, mingling with the sound of meat browning in a skillet. That meant burritos, or tacos, my favorites. I closed the door behind me and crossed through the living room to the bright, airy kitchen. Mother had decorated it a few years ago in a country-type flavor with blue gingham prints and pale yellow cupboards. I was more a fan of contemporary style with dark cabinets and lighter countertops, but my mother had been insistent. "Hey, honey, how was work?" My mother turned from the stove at the sound of my footsteps. The house was so old that many of the floorboards creaked. It was impossible to sneak up on someone. I had found that out the one time I had tried to sneak out to a party in high school. My mother had been up before I even hit the front door, and I had been grounded for 2 weeks after. I hated the floor back then, but now it brought comfort. It was okay. I have a new research project on my plate that's going to mean some late nights of work. I situated myself in one of the bar stools, leaning back as far as I could to stretch my ever-increasing belly. People did not think about pregnant women when they made straight-back chairs. A line of worry etched across her face. "Are you sure you want to keep doing this job? Those long hours can be hard when you're pregnant, and they'll be impossible once she comes." "I know, Mom, but I'm not sure what else to do yet. I might as well stay as long as I can because the money's good and will sure help out when hope comes." My mother's worry had been the same one running circles through my mind. The late nights were taking a toll on my health, and I knew I couldn't continue them much longer. But not many companies were looking to hire a woman 5 months pregnant. Still, I kept my ears open and perused the ads daily on my break. I definitely have to find another job once hope arrived, though I would definitely miss Tina. The worry didn't fade completely from my mother's face, but she nodded and turned back to stir the meat. I traced my finger across the ecru bar counter. "Mom, do you believe in coincidences?" "What do you mean, honey?" With the meat at the temperature she wanted, my mother lowered the flame and turned to the bar where a cutting board held a few tomatoes and some lettuce. She picked up the knife and began slicing the ripe red fruit. This afternoon, I could have sworn a man I met while I was in the Caribbean was at the coffee shop. I smiled, remembering the waterfall and the van ride that had allowed me to jostle against him, and a tingle ran down my spine. I take it you liked him? I sighed. I did, but I didn't realize it back then. Then Daniel called, and I was so confused that I took him back. JD, that was his name, left, and I thought I'd never see him again. But a few months ago, I found a travel book he had given me the day he left, and inside was a picture of us and a note. Then the other night when I was reading, I ran across a verse that reminded me of him, and today I could have sworn he was at Cup of Joe. Did you talk to him? Mother chopped the tomato slices into squares, scraped them into a bowl, and grabbed the head of lettuce. No, I was in the drive-thru lane and he was getting in his car. There wasn't time. I dropped my head into my hands, all my confidence from my earlier talk with Tina fading. Well, I don't believe in coincidence, my mother smiled. See, God knew us before we were born and had a plan for us. So I tend to think that God has a hand in everything that happens in our life, including things we might see as coincidences. That's basically what Tina said, that God brought him here, so maybe we are destined to meet again. She smiled back at me. What do you think, Callie? I think I'm going to continue to pray about it and ask God's wisdom. A wistful smile crossed my face, but I have to say, I don't think I'd mind if JD were in my life. As my mother chopped the lettuce, I regaled her with stories of the few days I had spent with JD. With every detail I remembered, I felt more and more sure that my mother was right. I had met JD for a reason.